Hello and welcome to the in-news series of Drishti IAS. I am Pooja Divedi, and in this segment today we are going to talk about how India needs to take more decisive and robust steps in order to deal with climate change. This topic is important from the perspective of prelims as well as important from the perspective of GS Mains Paper 3. So let's begin with the topics of discussion. First of all, we will talk about why news, which will be followed by Climate Ambition Summit of 2020, and then we will talk about Paris Accord of 2015 in brief, and we will discuss India's intended nationally determined contribution and how India is achieving them bit by bit. We will talk about the achievements of India, we will talk about the challenges posed, the way forward, and in the midst of the segment, I am going to ask you prelims-based question. Please comment the correct answer in the comment segment. So why in news? Because last week only, the 5th anniversary of the Paris Accord was celebrated and a virtual meeting was held by the name of Climate Ambitious Summit. And at that meeting, the Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, has said that India has made a solemn pledge that by 2047, India will not only achieve its target of reducing carbon emissions, but also exceed the expectation. And he also discussed achievements of India. And if we talk about the achievements of India, he has discussed in that summit. The first one was how India has consistently been on the path and reduced the carbon emission intensity of its GDP by 21%. 21% if we compare them to the level of 2005. And he also said that from the year 2014, India's meager capacity of 2 gigawatt of solar energy went to 36 gigawatt of solar energy in the year 2020. And India has the 4th largest non-renewable capacity, India has the 4th largest renewable capacity to get its accumulative energy, and has also said that India has consistently remained a country to achieve its path. So you can see the highest emitter here is China, then comes USA, then comes European Union, and lastly comes India. He also said if we talk about the historical emissions, he also said that we must not lose sight of the historical emissions of different countries and how each and every country should continue to review its moves and steps towards tackling climate change under the Paris Accord. So now we will talk about the Climate Ambition Summit. So this particular summit, its objective is to set out a new and ambitious commitments under the pillars of the Paris Agreement by the name of mitigation, adaptation and finance commitments. So what is mitigation? That means to reduce the negative impacts or to deal with the negative impacts of the climate change. Then comes adaptation in two sense. First, to make the world resilient to climate change, and second, also to adapt more greener technologies, and of course, finance commitments. So, in reaction to whatever the Prime Minister of India said, Alka Kelkar, she said that the commitment which was made by the developed countries that they will mobilize $100 billion in order to assist the developing countries to make them resilient to climate change must be fulfilled. Alright, and its scope is the summit will provide a more meaningful platform for businesses and other stakeholders in order to deal with the climate change. Also, it will accelerate the systematic change which is required to reduce emission and also build resilience. These are the pillars: reduce emission and build resilience, because climate change is a reality. We have to be resilient. We cannot say no, this doesn't exist and we can go on with our lives. That's not possible. We, especially India, has to be resistant enough. Moving on. It was hosted by the United Nations, United Kingdom, France, in participation with Chile and Italy. And if we talk about the current status of the global greenhouse emissions, basically CO2 emissions. If we talk about historical emissions, US has been the largest emitter, that was 25%. Its share was 25%. And then it was followed by European Union with 22%. And if we talk about China, it was 13%. For India, it was just about 3%. And if we talk about the current status is not very rosy. And 5 years after the Paris agreements, although all states have submitted their nationally determined contributions how to mitigate and adapt to climate change, but as you can see, it's still moving on. The emissions, the CO2, are still reaching here. You can see this is 2020, and from 2000 level you can see it's still rising despite the fact that countries are doing so much. So the contributions are radically insufficient in order to reach well below 2 degrees Celsius limit and are even further from 1.5 degrees Celsius and as identified under the Paris Accord. And besides India, there are very few countries who are which are actually compatible, 2 degrees Celsius compatible under the climate agreement, the Paris Agreement. You can note down the names: Bhutan, Philippines, Costa Rica, Ethiopia, Morocco and Gambia. These were complying with the accord. Please also note down that China, as we discussed, has the highest greenhouse gas emissions, that is 30%. US contributes 13.5% and EU 8.7%. So right now it's China, followed by US and then European Union. These three countries were the historical emitters as well. Now back then it was, as we discussed, US had 25%, China had 13% and EU had 22%. Moving on. If we talk about India's current emission level, India is doing great if we compare it to the other countries. So, as United Nations report released earlier, it stated that India's per capita emission are actually 60% lower than the global average, and the emissions in the country grew 1.4% in 2009, which is much lower than its own average of 3.3% per year over the last decade. So that means that this is a positive sign for India, right? Moving on. If we talk about the Paris Accord, it is also famously known as Conference of Parties 21. Tell me in the comment segment, where was Conference of Parties 20 happened and where did Conference of Parties 22nd happen? Okay, because this could be asked in your prelims exam, COP21, and you have to match them with the countries they occurred in. Alright, so if we talk about COP21, that is famously known as the Paris Accord, and it was adopted in the year 2015 to address the climate change and its negative impacts, and it replaced the Kyoto Protocol, which was an earlier agreement prior to this in order to deal with climate change. Also, its aim is to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions in an effort to limit the global temperature well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels while pursuing the means to limit 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2100. If you want to note it down, kindly do it. Moving on. Now, if we talk about its inclusion, it includes financial assistance to those countries which are vulnerable to climate change. That means providing them financial and monetary assistance, and that is the role of the developing countries. And also raising money to help the developing countries to adapt to climate change and transition to clean energy. So adapt to climate change means being climate resilient, and this could be achieved by financial assistance as well as technology assistance, technological know-how. If a developed country is providing that to a developing country, then only it can transit easily to get clean energy. Also, this part of the deal has been made non-legally binding, and that is the reason, that is the issue with this agreement, that because it is non-legally binding in nature, what is happening? The climate change nationally determined contributions are not actually that good that it could have been there if it were a legally binding agreement, right? Moving on. Before the conference started, more than 180 countries, they already submitted their pledges to cut down the carbon emissions by the name of intended nationally determined contribution. So this accord also has the provision of it. The INDCs, these were recognized in the agreement, but again these are non-binding in nature. Alright, so if we talk about India's INDCs, famously we have 3 INDCs, principal INDCs. First is to reduce the carbon emission intensity of the GDP by 33 to 35% by the year 2030 if we compare them to the level of 2005. This is the first one. The second one is that 40% of the installed capacity for getting energy will be from non-fossil based sources such as renewable energy. And the third was to get a carbon sink for carbon sequestration, that means capturing carbon and storing them, of 2.5 to 3 billion metric ton CO2 equivalent with the help of planting more trees and more forest cover. So India is doing pretty well on the first 2 parameters, but it is lagging behind in the third parameter. We will talk about it more. So as you can see, India, as we discussed already, that it is one of the countries which is 2 degrees Celsius compatible under the Paris Accord. Moving on, and this is the data from Climate Action Tracker. You can visit the website as well. Okay, moving on, let's talk about India's achievements. So in the beginning of the video, I had already discussed the achievements. So you can see here also we will discuss the achievements. So in the second biennial update report, which was submitted to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change in the year 2019, India had claimed that it had reduced the emission intensity of its economy by 21% if we compare them to 2014 level, okay, 2014 to 2019. Also, non-fossil sources accounted for about 37% of the India's power capacity as of September 2009, and this was claimed by the Central Electricity Authority. I will move and you can screenshot it. Over the last 6 years, there has been a 72% increase in installed renewables capacity, and this has been claimed by the Minister of Power. Also, analysts have agreed that the progress on forestry goal was far from robust. As I told you that India is not doing very well in this particular segment on the third parameter. Reason? There are 2. First, that there are certain categories under which if the plantations or under which if the forests are there, then only it is counted as a forest. So whatever activity is happening in the notified forest segment, that only is counted. Alright, first. And the activities which are taking place or the tree cover which is there outside that notified area is not counted. First, this is the first problem. Second is that agriculture is also contributing and is also acting as carbon sinks, but that is also not included. The agriculture segment is not included. So the degraded forest land which have been taken to continue with agricultural practices, they are not considered. So that is the reason. This is what the government of India has said, that is the reason the third parameter India is lagging behind. Alright, the Green India mission. Now this is one of the missions of India which has actually failed to get India on the right track. Also, this India is making reasonable progress as discussed on 2 of the 3 parameters. Okay. Now some of the measures, if we talk about what have been some of the measures that has helped India to get well with the first and the second parameter. First is the Bharat stage of BS4 norms. Okay, so these are emissions control standards put in place by the government to keep a check on air pollution, that means electrification of transportation. Then comes National Solar Mission, which is a major initiative of the Government of India and state governments to promote ecologically sustainable growth while addressing India's energy security. So as of March 2020, India has 42 solar parks, and India, as it is a solar-rich country, India is doing great in this particular area. And if we talk about rooftop solar electricity, rooftop solar power generators, it is 70% of the, it is actually 2.1 it is providing 2.1 gigawatt of electricity, that means power, and 70% of this particular gigawatt of energy is being utilized by commercial activities and industries. So not only on-grid India is doing very great, but also for off-grid it is also doing very great. Also, National Wind Solar Hybrid Policy of 2018, if we talk about, it provides a framework to use solar and wind energy in order to use electricity and in order to generate electricity with the optimal use of these renewable energies. So you must have heard, and we have also covered it in one of our in-news segments, that India right now has built one of its kind hybrid renewable energy park in Kutch, and it is being touted as one of the greatest projects of India. So it will have both solar energy generation and also wind energy generation. Now, all these and many other initiatives have helped India in order to cut down its CO2 emissions. Right? Moving on, let's talk about one more initiative that India has taken. India has established a national level committee in the month of November 2020 in order to get on a coordinated approach, because there will be different ministers, different stakeholders from different ministries, in order to approach the National Action Plan for Climate Change in a very coordinated manner and fulfill its obligations under the Paris Accord of 2015. Okay, do read about it. Moving on. If we talk about the challenges, the first is we have categorized it into three different groups. First is the carbon emissions. So if we talk about carbon emissions, there is still increasing dependence on coal. Even if India reaches at a point where it is generating 175 gigawatt of energy from renewable sources by the year 2022, coal will still be 65% of the energy mix of India for generating electricity. So this is evident how? Because for the first time ever, India had decided to open 41 coal blocks to the private sector because India was increasingly dependent on import of coal. Right? You can see it here. Please note it down also. And if we talk about the problems with renewable energy, the installation capacity has been hindered due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Because on August 21st, the Central Energy Authority, it published a report, and in that report it said that there were 90 renewable energy projects that were hindered, that were on hold, and that was these 90 renewable energy projects were 39.4 gigawatts of energy, and further 8 were given extension because of the pandemic. 8 gigawatt worth of projects were given extension because of the pandemic. Also, the biggest challenge here is that the renewable energies have to compete still with the coal, because coal, although it is being reduced, but it is not being reduced at a level that has been expected. We are still transiting, so it still has to compete with coal. So the main issue here is that most of the grid is still inclined towards thermal power industry. And another problem is that the DISCOMs have already been under financial distress, so they cannot modernize their own plants. Moving on, let's talk about carbon sequestration. We already talked that why India is lagging behind in that particular parameter. And the target of 33% of forest cover is still remaining to be achieved, because India currently stands at 21% of the total geographical area. So if we talk about the loss of biodiversity and loss of green cover in certain regions, Western Ghats have allegedly lost a third of their ecological ecosystem, of their ecological biodiversity because of the expansion of population. And also the northeastern areas has suffered a lot. Only 2 states are there, Assam and Tripura, who are still in the process of conserving their forests. But the rest of the states are in a very bad state when it comes to green cover. Okay, so that is also a problem. Now what is the way forward? Electrification of transport is a must right now, because this is seeming to be the most promising sector as India is moving towards electrifying its transport system, and transport system also contributes a lot to the greenhouse gas emission. So the Indian Railways too is expected to go fully electrified by the year 2024, because prior to that, in the year 2023, it will electrify its lines. So that's a good news. Also, if you can see this chart, here is the transport sector, which is contributing to greenhouse gas emission. So we do need electrification of this particular sector in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And also what we can do? We have to strengthen the renewable energy sector, because it is expected that by the year 2040, around 49% of the total electricity will be generated with the help of renewable energy, and more efficient batteries will be there to store electricity, which will further cut the solar energy cost by 66%. And we have to increase afforestation also. That is the biggest challenge and the biggest way forward for India as well. So India, under the Bond Challenge, is already committed to the goal of having or restoring 13 million hectares of degraded and deforested land by 2020, and additional 8 million hectares by the year 2030. So we have to move ahead in this sector much more faster. So if we talk about the way forward, what can India do in this particular sector? India needs to redefine forest and how to measure it. That means we need a redefined definition of forest, so that we can actually know what is our forest cover. Now this particular thing can be achieved with the help of advanced satellites, and we can look out the notified areas as well in order to know what is the forest cover actually of the country. India should also update its forest policies, because the forest policy of 1952-1988 needs to be revamped in order to provide better policies for better community participation and all that. So we need better forest policies as well. The forestry department needs to look into it. And also, effective institutional and monitoring mechanisms are needed, because many times there have been complaints to the National Green Tribunal that the Kampa funds are not being utilized properly. So the different states must be very careful of the fact that whatever the Kampa funds are there should be used actually in actual restoration of the forest and not misused. And also, local communities should be empowered, because they are more adaptive in nature, which land to use, how to use it, which plants to be grown. They know much more than the bureaucracy. So these communities should be also on board. Okay. So NABARD's Wadi program was there, which has shown that how ecological restoration can happen with the help of local communities. Okay. So I hope you have found this segment informative, and I hope you will definitely try to revise it in the future for your exam. So that's it for today. Tomorrow we shall meet again. Until then, stay updated, and thank you so much for watching.